Okay, it's another episode of Talk to Thorin, and I'm here with LiQuiD112. If anyone indeed still calls him that, I still call you that, mate. 'Cause I call people by the gamer tag. A lot of people probably know you now, Steve Arhancet. You know, they use your real name nowadays.
Yeah,
But we
some
have a
people
lot
go
to.
Big Steve.
They
So,
do, really?
yeah, Big
Okay.
Steve is pretty popular.
Guess it depends how well they know you, right?
Yeah.
So, we'll start off. The topic for this episode is going to be about the LCS franchising, also known, it's got its own terminology as the permanent partnership, I guess, program concept, going into essentially franchising the NA LCS starting next year. And I will say at the outset, obviously a lot was actually revealed and kind of outlined roughly by Riot in the post. It was a pretty epic post, I have to say. They really went in depth on that one. You know, it wasn't just one of those where there's like one paragraph worth reading, but every detail has not been so far explained, and some things obviously are under NDAs, you know, so you legally actually are not allowed to talk about them. But I've seen you do a lot of interviews in the past. I'm sure you'll have no problem telling us when that's the case, and you can't specifically give us a detail. So actually, in general, one of the main areas I want to discuss this topic is any area where it would just be something like, you know, we can't literally talk about a number that hasn't been released. I think it's just more interesting to make it like an abstract question, you know, like what would you think of something like this? What would you, and then there's no issue, I think, in general talking about it. So the place I want to start with this is it'd be one thing if no one had ever even talked about franchising. And then one day, you know, Riot came to all the owners came to Riot, there was a discussion, and then we had this exact scenario take place. Okay, then we'd only have to start the discussion here. But I want to actually know because last year there was a letter published by Reginald, which as far as I know, many people essentially were on board with who were LCS owners, where it was kind of a plea, a request to Riot that, you know, we want to partner with you essentially. You know, we want to be your partners and we want some kind of, I mean, it was intimated it should be a franchising system, if we remember, unfortunately, the circumstances in which it came from was after Mark Merrill's perhaps ill-timed or ill-phrased comments about how much
Emotionally
league
charged.
orgs,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, about how much league orgs made and the fact that, you know, maybe they should input more into league. And so that was obviously perfect timing to bring up the idea of, well, you know, maybe a bottleneck for how much we can make from our league teams and how much we can invest is we don't have franchising. You know, we've got relegation here. All the, you know, it was a very reasonable method. But how did you get from there, an open letter, to permanent partnership? Can you give us some kind of insight?
Yeah. Um, so I think that the idea of a franchise-like system had been discussed with Riot or around Riot for years leading up to June 1st. But it always had been in context of we, the team owners, are unsatisfied with the level of security that we have with the investments that we make into the North American LCS, and the fear associated with if we were to spend $1 million on a player or $2 million on a facility or an extra $1 million on staff to hire content folks, that those investments into League of Legends could fall off a cliff and you could be relegated from the LCS, and that was a risky investment. And so that was for team owners that were using the capital that they were receiving from the partners that they have or sponsors. And so the types of dollars associated with making those investments are very close to the chest, right? It's like if you were to go into your personal bank account and loan a friend money to go and start their own business. And so that was like a lot of the fear about not creating a sustainable environment. And then there was a point in time where Riot started to make investigative measures into what the monetization methods could look like for the league and how much. So they started asking themselves questions like, how much can we generate if we were to sell either an exclusive or co-exclusive license for the media rights of the LCS to a company that's interested in purchasing those? What's the dollar value? What's the market value? This hasn't been done before. What if we were to go to clothing sponsors and find out how much they would pay for the total number of impressions that they're getting across all teams? What would that number look like? And so during this whole time, they started to not just think about let's grow the league as big as possible, but how do we now monetize this league that we've grown to this size? And once that happened, teams started to also consider not just from a protective standpoint, but also from a, hey, share the pie. And I think one of the biggest announcements in that regard was the BAM deal, right? Which I believe was
Sure,
a
yes.
$250 million deal, $50 million per year. And if you actually look into the specifics associated with the deal, it's not even in like an exclusive license for the broadcast. It has more to do with the advertising inventory. It's just an MG. So like, it's a very small component of the actual bigger opportunity for the revenue. And so when that was disclosed, it was like, oh, well, there's like an opportunity for this pie to be pretty big and to be shared with teams and players. And so I think that kind of happened. And then it got to the point where Riot took a very collaborative approach with teams and players and invited us to have a seat at the table to express the things that were important to us. And that was on a team-by-team basis and also as a group. And I think through that, they said, thanks, appreciate, what you have to say and all those things. We'd also like to take a look at your companies and really find out how much of this is, bluffing or like real, and what kind of misconceptions do we have about the financial status of some of the incumbent teams. And we just want to look at your books pretty much. And at least I can speak for TL, we were happy to share that information. So that then led to a proposal and I think an architecture that Riot embarked on for X amount of time. And then they released the information to us, which I actually really appreciate the fact that they came to the teams first and like told us what was going to happen. I don't think they had any obligation to do so. And then they informed the players as kind of a wrap-up summary to a lot of other conversations, and then publicly announced. So therein was the long-winded answer of the timeline.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff there to unpack. So one thing I found very interesting was the part where Riot sort of did an investigation, essentially into like what can teams make, what could they make, and then adding that into the idea of, well, what can the Riot end of it make with something like the BAM deal, for example, and seeing like essentially what they were scouting was like, what would a partnership look like? Are these actually partners? For example, I wouldn't want to partner with someone where I have no idea if they'll make me any money. Like, why would I make some money and then give some to him? But along those lines, that's a question I have for you. Okay, so someone who was here from the beginning of LCS, if you remember when LCS was first announced, the way they really put like the marketing emphasis was on the notion that this is for the players. Like, we want a professional league for the players. They never ever said in the early days, this will one day be a thing where it makes a lot of revenue. They never actually pushed the angle of this is going to be the NFL of esports or whatever, And actually, if you look, it took many, many years before there was almost any discussion of like, there'll be sponsors for LCS. And then, like we say now, broadcast rights potentially one day. So actually, there was a long period of time where the notion of franchising wouldn't necessarily have meant that much to teams because you wouldn't be getting a cut of anything. There was no revenue for the league, And if you remember, one of the weird comments they used to make in the early days was they'd actually kind of say, it was kind of a bizarre statement to make, they'd actually make the point that they didn't make any money off league esports, but they'd kind of make that like, almost as though like, we're doing you guys a favor, by doing this league. We don't make money; we lose money from league esports. So
what you do on skins?
Sure, yeah, that was my line. I always used to counter it with, which was, well, it's essentially a marketing adjunct, right? It's like, yeah, no one makes money off the advert they make, but you make the advert to make money off your product, But here's the question then: why do you think in the early days of league there wasn't any emphasis on making money? I mean, to be very, very crude, okay. If I could go back in time and I could take Jack Etienne from Cloud9 with me and make him the commissioner of the LCS and he would have power to make deals, I reckon from day one he could be making sponsorship deals and getting rights over here, and maybe there'd even be a thing where Twitch would pay for part of the whatever it would be, even at the early level there could have been some deal. Why do you think it took a lot of years before they kind of turned their eyes to making money from LCS?
I mean, it's my opinion that when you are trying to create a product that is trying to reach as many people as possible and have an engaging experience with as many people as possible, if your first motivation is to monetize that product, then you may be incentivized to make decisions along the way that may actually harm the uh, future potential of what that product could be.
Sure.
And so those are on a lot of different instances, right? Because it could be as something as simple as like, where are we going to have the World Finals? Well, we're trying to reduce costs, so maybe we do it here, or maybe it's what the production value is going to be. And if you start putting a budget and almost like a monetization emphasis on something that you're just trying to grow for the pure purposes of fandom, engagement, and reach, then I think you may end up with a different product in the end. And that is just like an overarching philosophy on like building something. And you could even say that that could be true for esports teams too, right? Like imagine a team that was so well capitalized, they had no necessity to actually go out and seek sponsorships. They would never have to, like as a lot of fans say, like sell out, right? Like
Sure.
they would just be really focused on what it meant to be like a Team Liquid fan, the experience, the engagement, like where the touch points are on when you believe that you've connected with our brand. And if you start to just if like let's say of my week, how much time I spend on partner management, procurement, it's significant, right? And if you start just allocating that just to the fan experience, you could end up with a heightened product. So if I was to try to put myself in their shoes on why they made that decision, it was because they cared about the product, which is the league or the LCS.
Okay. So to touch back on that original statement last year, the one where it wasn't, here's the thing, it's not like they literally said like, oh, these owners don't put any money in. It was almost like an offhand comment. It's just the implication of it was what kind of set people off the idea that like, well, why should I put money from whatever CSGO or Dota into League of Legends, So when I spoke to a number of team owners around that time in LCS, most of them, what shocked them was they actually said, like the ones who had good league teams were like, my league team loses money. Like, have you seen the salaries I have to pay some of these players? It's crazy. But at the time, obviously, you don't get any league revenue. You work off the sponsorship model still. Did teams like Team Liquid, did you make much money from League of Legends? Was there something of a bottleneck before a franchising model was put in place?
Mm-hmm. Team Liquid, we've been fortunate enough to be much bigger than just like a hobby esports team. We've built a full business around esports, and specifically with regards to League of Legends, League in the past 5 years has been the front runner. They're the ones setting the pace, and they also have generated the most viewership and engagement, and also press around their league. And I think it's also been polished, and most importantly, it's been the league. And when I say the league, I mean that it's not in a sea of other leagues where it's congested, kind of like Counter-Strike. And so they were able to create something that was actually attractive enough to partners. And I think for us, we generated a great portion of our sponsorship revenue from our participation as a league team. With that being said, most of our partners, they sponsor Team Liquid because of the reach that we have across multiple games. And because that reach is significant in those other games, and we have consistently winning teams, there's an allocation of those sponsor dollars that end up being appreciated because of our involvement in those games. There's no like firm line or when a partner signs up with us, we don't put in the contract like X percentage is for League and Y percentage is for
Sure.
Dota, and it just doesn't happen that way. So, you know, uh, there's a more qualitative kind of approach to where the value allocation goes, and that varies depending on partner. So we've been fortunate enough to generate revenue and run a real business and prove that we can get sponsors and maintain partners. I think we just renewed our 6th year with Alienware and Razer, and we've also added like the production company One Up Studios that does content around all of our teams and players, and Liquid Media, which is an agency. So, for us, we don't view ourselves in the same bucket as some of these other esports teams that are just kind of having fun, from what I sometimes see, and just losing money and being okay with losing money and not having like the initiative to run a real business.
So one of the when I said the post was epic, unfortunately that means naturally not only did most people not read it all, but there's a lot to digest there. So one of the things that people immediately zeroed in on, maybe it's because of the ambience in the industry about the Overwatch League, was this $10 million number. People saw $10 million to be a permanent partner. And that's not even like, at least the Overwatch League one, it's variable. No one really knows if it's 1 million or if it's 30 million. The idea is it's 10 million for everyone. Right. Mm-hmm. I had a question I raised along these lines when I did my eSports Salon episode with Reginald and Hotshot and Ocelot, which was basically, how reasonable is it that you could have, say, 10 teams that can get the $10 million? I mean, as far as I know right now, almost no teams actually have 10 million. I mean, definitely don't have 10 million in the bank. Maybe people have taken millions in investment, such as Team Liquid. So yes, I'm sure Team Liquid and I'm sure Immortals and, some of the most savvy people with good connections, they could get the 10 million. But it seemed like there was split opinions. Like Ocelot thought, okay, a few teams, maybe 5, 6 top Western teams could get this money from the other ones. Okay, then you're really coming down to like, can they convince, the Patriots to partner with them, and are they capable on that level? But he wasn't as sure. Reginald thinks everyone could. Reginald thinks you could get 30 teams that could get the $10 million just because, all those other partners would want someone to work with initially. What is your sense for that? Like is it as easy as having a whole league where, like for example, the reason why I'm putting this question out there is, it wasn't like they just said, okay, all you have to do to be in the league is give us $10 million. If they'd have said that, then it'd be a different question. Maybe then anyone could do it. But they really did put a lot of criteria out there where that implied, this is going to be a filtering thing. You get the 10 million, that's step one, Then it's who are you and what have you done and what will you do and what's your business plan. But you've got to have a lot of people who can get the 10 million before you can do that step. So what is your sense for how reasonable it is for everyone to get $10 million?
Yeah. So there's 2 aspects to this. There's one, the actual number, which is like sticky. It's the headline number, right? But almost as important and has the same degree of weight as that number are the payment terms associated with the number, because there's a very big difference between sending $10 million and wiring it the day before LCS starts, right?
Sure.
Versus you paying that over time. And I think the way that Riot has proposed the payment of that with 5 million and then 1.5, 1.5, and then the 2 only being due if the league is under certain metrics, is really convincing, right? Because it's saying, look, you don't need to have all of this up front. You can earn this over time. Hopefully, the revenue you receive during the operation of the league can help pay for the league franchise fee, and then you may not even need to pay the extra 2 at the end if we're all doing well, which is like a lot of incentives along the way, right? So that, I think, has a couple of effects. One, it allows endemic teams that may not have the wherewithal or the cash reserve to afford that to still participate in the league. And 2, if you don't have the capital, there is so much interest from parties like, let's say, the Patriots that don't have the management expertise, the incumbent fan base, or the relationship with Riot to have strength in their application. And so they want to be able to partner up with, let's say, like a CLG. And I don't think that there's going to be any issue with a company like CLG raising the amount of capital that they need in order to pay the franchise fee. And if a company like, I'm just using CLG randomly, I'm
Sure,
not
yes.
saying anything about CLG, but if they can't raise that, then I think that says something about their management group, that they couldn't even raise the necessary funds to participate in the league, which would also be like an indication of the type of management that would be expected as a franchise owner. So it does a few things, and most importantly, or as important as the payment terms, is the amount or the price. And from my perspective, just based on knowledge of how the league will work from a financial perspective, as well as pre-existing deals like the BAM deal, and talking to partners in the industry interested in sponsoring these types of assets, this thing is completely underpriced. Like they could have easily charged and sold, from my perspective, these spots for triple or quadruple that. And which just gets me thinking, okay, well then why did Riot decide to do a $10 million price with the extended payment terms that may be $8 million if they could have charged 30 or 40 million? And that would only lead me to believe that the reason they did that is because they want as many applications as possible, because they care more about the
so
management.
The other factors will be the key elements,
right.
You think, not the $10 million, right?
Right. It's like they want great partners, and they'd rather pick from great partners. And then if those great partners have additional capital above and beyond the franchise fee, that they're investing that into their teams. So all in all, I think, yeah,
on the basis of what you said there, like clearly a key piece of context there is that actually the payment plan as well, and the way it works, as well as things that we can't know in the public, about how the revenue will be shared and what potential deals they might have, make it that, essentially, like, there's a lot of people want to be involved and would put up the money to, essentially, they'd be the bankroll guys for this. Does that mean that some of these people like had interest in esports before, but they weren't willing to come in without a franchise model? Like, I've heard stories in the past. A name that everyone can throw out there because they've no doubt seen the interviews is Mark Cuban has intimated many times that he's interested in esports, but if you look at it, that guy could have been in from a long time ago, but it seems like he's been waiting again. I often hear the story that people on that level, unless it's a franchise model, they just don't want to get involved in, because they've heard the stories of the NRGs and stuff, and that you can just essentially, it's not, you don't ultimately lose everything, but you certainly can get massively set back.
Yeah. It's funny with Mark Cuban. I ran into him at an event, and I went up to him and said, "Hey, Mark." He's like, "Hey, Steve." And I was like, "Wait, you know my name?" He's like, "We've been looking at this space." So he has, I think, in particular, done his research. But I think one of the, him alongside people like him in this example, one of the reasons why they've been, I'm talking for them, but I think one of the reasons why they've been so apprehensive about getting involved in esports is because up until this date, June 1st, esports teams have been agencies representing players, and in exchange for participation in the leagues that we compete in, we receive sometimes subsidies, sometimes nothing, and we are basically operating and chasing to no real sustainable future. And I think people like Mark Cuban saw that and said, wait. So you're just saying that you manage these teams and players, but you don't have permanent contracts with the leagues, and you're just getting cut of prize money, and you're selling advertising? Like, it sounds like an agency. This doesn't sound like a sports team.
Yeah.
And so for me, like, this is a moment where you are a sports team. Like, you have a franchise-like position forever in a particular game. And so, yeah, I think people will start to reconsider and say, oh, wow. Like, and they're limited, and there's only 10, and maybe there's an opportunity to get in later if there's expansion. Like, I think the interest will be great. I know it is great. So.
Okay. So another interesting number in that was that they said they would raise the minimum salary to $75,000, presumably per player. They weren't really as clear on that, but it was very obvious assumption there. Now, To a lot of people who don't know what the salaries of pro players make, obviously there are many players in LCS who make more than that in a year. Like that is not a big deal.
Anymore. Yeah.
Some may indeed play for Team Liquid. Who can know these things, right? But for the worst player in LCS, would that be a significant boost in salary? Like, will that ask a lot more of the teams that, if the ones that exist right now, if they were to come into this franchise model, would that actually be much of an ask? I mean, some people might naively think maybe that's already what everyone makes anyway.
I don't have intimate. I mean, I can only speak for TL, and the $75,000 level is like it doesn't even mean anything, because
Sure.
it doesn't mean anything for us and our players. But I think there may be other teams. Actually, I don't even want to insinuate. Well, yes, there may be other teams that are paying the minimum salaries to players, and maybe it's justified, maybe it's not. It's just really an agreement between the player and the org. But you know, I, I guess it's good to set a line in the sand to say, hey, if you want to try to do and scrape by or pay the lowest amount possible, then this is the bar for that. And I guess sometimes you create rules that hopefully aren't used, but they're a rule nonetheless. So in my perspective, this is one of those things where it's a rule. Hopefully it's not ever like really used or put in context, but it's there in case it needs to be enforced.
I've noticed a lot of the owners try to sell really hard the angle of how great it is to get rid of relegation, and about, like, a lot of them sell it okay in ways that, like, here's the thing, yeah, there's something to it, but I'm not always convinced. Like, for example, when they tell me the angle of, like, they always go with this hypothetical example, right? Which is like, I could have, tried out this young talent and maybe he would have developed. But they always make it sound like, but I'm so scared of relegation, I had to put in and then insert, like reused talent that we all know is never going to be the best, but they're good. At least they can play in LCS, And the implication is people are doing that a lot. Now, I'm not entirely sure when you look at LCS that it's that cynical, I see a lot of teams trying out rookies, and then a lot of teams who actually don't bother getting the old guy who's not that good. It's a fairly mixed bunch. Okay, but the reason why a lot of that doesn't really ever have to be tested in the laboratory of the LCS is because it's like Immortals telling me that. It's like TSM telling me that. It's like, well, your teams never really are going to relegation. In fact, you can sign the young rookie and he can be amazing. So here's the thing: Team Liquid was in the relegation position. What would you actually have been able to do differently in the past couple of seasons, if there had been no relegation? If you hadn't ever had to worry about actually going out of the league, would you have developed players differently? Would you have made a longer term contract with certain players? What do you think you could have done differently?
Yeah, I think if we were franchise owners sooner, then both Victor and I would have felt much more confident taking a larger percentage of our revenues and investing them into the infrastructure for League of Legends. I know that for a fact, actually, because we've made decisions on like holding off on facilities because we just weren't sure. Like we just I think we're the first esports team to embark on a full like gaming facility for all of our teams and players that's going to be next to Riot, and we had to put a substantial deposit down and to even do all the build out and everything. We've always been apprehensive to do things like that because we don't know if we'll be relegated in 6 months, and that just goes down the tubes. And so it's difficult to make those kinds of investments. It's also, I think, difficult to make similar types of investments into players for longer term contracts. And even furthermore, we have always thought that some players are like franchise-like players, and we've wanted to offer like profit sharing or some sort of ability to earn stock in the company. And we've also been apprehensive about that too, right? Like, because if we have a player and then we're relegated and then they have, stock in Team Liquid, and then we're not in LCS anymore. It just doesn't make sense, right?
Sure, yeah.
So there's a lot of, and then of course like all the staff associated around the team and players. So you're talking about a lot of factors. So it's like staff and employee retention and investment. And so we would have made a lot of these decisions much earlier. And we haven't even pulled the trigger on everything because we're not, we hope that we have a phenomenal application for franchise and Riot accepts us, but we don't know 100%. And so until we do, we can't even pull the trigger on those other ideas that we want to tackle. So for me, I think short answer is that we would have made a lot of different decisions that invest more into what we're doing in League of Legends earlier.
So this might sound like a very abstract way to phrase this question, but as an outsider, I have to be very naive. I can only look at the public information. So in a weird way, I could see a world in which a team like CLG, who I actually personally would pick as a good example of a team where I think that's an obvious team who suffered from not ever taking in big investment, because from the little things I know about player salaries, etc., they can't necessarily just go and buy the really big name Korean. And you notice they have kind of stuck with good players from NA, etc., but not necessarily upgraded all the time positions. They haven't really gone hell for leather to compete with whoever is paying the most salary. And as a result, their results haven't been as great the last couple of seasons. Okay, admittedly, they got a lot out of the team they had last year. So to me, they were kind of losing the game to some degree of how the LCS was played before, because they didn't give up any equity and they decided to stick with their position. But in a weird way, in this world now where everyone has to raise this money if they want to be an LCS, they want to be a permanent partner, and you now go ahead and you get some money and you get a partner on board and you give up some equity now, in a strange sense, aren't they in a better position? Like, presumably, when you took on all this money from the team that invested in you, you presumably had to give up some equity to do so, right? So you're kind of having to almost, not literally remortgage, but in some sense you're going to have to give up more equity, right? If you want even more money, or you have to get the same partner to themselves invest more. It's a tough position to be in if you were already someone who took the investment, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a tough position, right? Because like most companies that exist outside of the esports world, they will take sometimes a round of financing and then a second round of financing and a third round of financing. Sure. And taking an additional round of financing doesn't necessarily dictate success or failure with the company. It just means how much money is required to make waves and get something done that's the objective of the company. And so part of it is within esports, understanding how much capital is actually required to make those waves. And before, if you were to go 2 years ago, $1 million was very different than what $1 million does today, right?
Sure.
So part of it is anticipating the direction of the industry and the overall costs associated with maintaining and also growing. And so for a team like Team Liquid, we are an organization where we're seeing so much opportunity within the esports space and want to do so many different things that the amount of capital that's required in order for us to do that may be more significant than a team that all they want to do is run a league team. So it kind of just depends on like what you want to do and where you're at. It's tough to say that one team would be better or worse off. I mean, if, like, for example, in the case of CLG, we, for example, Axiomatic, which is our investor group, is some really great people that think very big and want to get great things not just things done. And so that thinking with that capitalization kind of enables Team Liquid to be on a better trajectory, even if we were to do multiple rounds, because of how we're thinking, rather than just like the value of particular one round that CLG might do now versus later.
Okay. So an idea that we brought up as an abstract, just as essentially a philosophical discussion on the esports salon that I wanted to get your take on, was again, if you look at LCS, part of the reason, presumably by Riot, also stated all those factors of, we want to know how you do things, what you've done in the past, if you can build a brand, etc., is that actually, whether they say it or not, I mean, the reasonable perspective on the league is most teams actually don't really fit all of those criteria. Like there's a lot of teams that have success but don't have fan base. They haven't built their brand. There's a lot of people who maybe they've done all right with the brand aspect, but maybe they haven't got a great structure built in terms of the infrastructure and the team. And also, a lot of people have strengths in one area and weaknesses in others. So if I was as an abstract concept to say, what if we took this LCS that's going to be next year and we just made it so that, okay, we all can understand the concept of why it's dangerous to allow anyone to take in as many Koreans and as many Chinese players as they want, right? That's obviously got its own problems that are just actually inherent to culture. Forget every other aspect of how good they are and all the rest of it. So what if we just said, okay, to get the best companies in, let's just make it so that NA and EU are considered the home region and it's just a combined player pool. So for example, say we had a team like, at the moment, you'd say G2 from Europe, okay? They seem like a very good organization. They've done a lot of great things the last year or so. And if in theory they didn't have to pick up NA players, they could use some of their EU players as the regional ones. And they say, hey, we want to be part of this franchising system. We could raise the money. We'd be a really great team. We've done a great job in a lot of these areas. What would you think as just an abstract concept, just you philosophically? What would you think of those teams being involved in an LCS? Would it be something you'd be in favor of? Should this stay as an NA thing? What do you think?
I think that the value of the franchise will be dependent upon its viewership and engagement and the ability to monetize that. And so participation from other teams in Europe that add that value, I think strengthen the franchise. And then it's a decision up to the parties of the franchise, the teams, players, and Riot, to say, does the inclusion of those additional teams generate more benefit than being divisible by an extra party?
Sure.
And so that's then the question of, does a G2 make sense? Does a Fnatic make sense? And in both of those particular cases, my personal opinion is absolutely, right? Those are great brands, and Ocelot's been kicking ass, but in other cases, it doesn't. And so in its totality, you can't say that inclusion of all of Europe makes sense into the North American LCS because you are then dividing by an extra team that doesn't add enough value. And then you add on top of that the value of a North American fan versus a European fan. And I don't mean like personally. What I mean is in terms of marketing.
Yes. Monetarily.
Yes. And so that has like a weight to the variable of like, just because you're a new team like P1, the fact that you're North American, like you already have like a 0.6 multiplier on a new European team, no matter what you do, even if you just lose all the time. So you just kind of like factor it and think about it that way. But yeah, philosophically, like adding additional brands that gain viewership to a franchise system make a lot of sense. But the how you work that out by including just some of the European teams, I mean, I don't know how you logistically pull that off.
So one element, if it's going to be NA focused, which as far as everyone knows at the moment in the public, it's only been discussed with the NA LCS in mind. Well, a lot of people, obviously, when they think about this concept of franchising, already had the Overwatch League in mind. That's going on with Blizzard and what they're doing in Overwatch there. And so an element that was quite sometimes subtly, but ultimately, if you look into the industry aspect, quite overtly implied, was the whole geolocation element to how the Overwatch League will run. And now no one yet knows the details of that, but a lot of people think that's kind of going to be their trick move, is that they're going to somehow get all the interest and the money in because they're going to eventually go towards a method where who knows how this would work, but there really will be a team that's from Los Angeles and they'll have fans and engagement with fans in Los Angeles, and therefore adding that to the global player base. Suddenly we've got more people watching, more people playing, more people spending money. It all sounds very utopian. It sounds very good. Does LCS, in your opinion, should it go towards this sort of method? Would it be a good thing if it could have this? Is it even realistic? Like in the world of esports and whatever esports is as a game, can it have any of those traditional sports elements in? Is it too utopian?
It's my personal belief that it would be a great idea to go with a geo-based team model, assuming that it was executed well. And here's why I feel that way. I think about when I was growing up and I would go to events, and I'm not a big sports guy, but I would go to a baseball game or I would go to a football game. And I didn't go because I actually wanted to watch the teams play. I went because I wanted to have some sort of experience with my friends, and I wanted to share in whatever that experience was, whether it was, oh my gosh, tailgating at an event or having a hot dog and a soda. So I think there is this huge, massive opportunity to bring people into a gaming experience where they can share with other people that share those same interests. And that doesn't have to necessarily be a League event or an Overwatch event, because that's not what you're selling, or that's not what you're selling to get people there. What you're selling is what they do when they're there, not just watching a particular game, but doing something, gaming, or some sort of festival-like type of aggregation of gamers doing something on a consistent basis during a season. And so for me, I think there is an opportunity. Let's say like Team Liquid was in a particular city, and our role and responsibility was to bring gamers that just maybe happened to be League of Legends fans or friends of somebody that was a League of Legends fan, and entice them into some sort of experience that happened on some sort of cadence. And I fully believe that Team Liquid would be able to pull that off. Like I feel like we could fill a venue and sell tickets and have concessions and have an ongoing thing. And yes, I think League of Legends is the game that can be the initial driver of that experience. And so I think that there's a lot of value in that for esports teams, and I think it's also possible. I just don't know the exact timing of it, and but I think that this is the necessary step to get to a point where that is executed on. So, yeah, that's my take.
For many of the reasons we've already outlined in this interview so far, League of Legends esports, compared to its potential, is obviously massively under-monetized at this point in time. Now, some people have done a very good job in their little niche, but even they, as we've kind of gone across, could have done more. Maybe would have invested more, which then could have yielded more, and could have built a lot more long-term partnerships, gotten better investment opportunities. There's a lot of things could have been done. So when people look at the esports scene and they talk about the health of a game, at the moment people again just go with pure metrics. They go, how many viewers does a game get? Is the viewing number going up and down? What demographics are interested in the game? If League of Legends, all the numbers just stayed static today, so I could tell you for the next 10 years they just never go up, they never go down. So there's pros and cons to that. No one knows yet what will happen. Would these sorts of moves, franchising, etc., would this kind of state we're in right now be fine going forwards for 5-10 years? Does it have to get much bigger to justify what presumably all the big investments that are going to come and all the big deal? What's your sense in that particular? What's your kind of take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the way that you approach coming to a solution for that is you start with how big is the pie, and the pie starts with the number of people that were born between certain years, and you could say that that's millennials, and then whatever the term is for the people after millennials, like Gen Y, I think, and the number of people, right? And then from that you say like how many of them are gamers, and then how many of them are in the state of Virginia, or how many of them are in Washington, D.C., and then you kind of like keep narrow how many colleges and universities and how many high schools and and you kind of get to a number, and you say, okay, well, either on a geo level or on a US level, these are the number of people that are actually consuming gaming content, who happen to be consuming League of Legends content. Are those numbers enough to move the needle on interest from advertisers and sponsors to participate? And I am of the belief that even if League of Legends were to stagnate or even decline, the number of people is so high and so under monetized that you could still have a burgeoning esports like industry and revenue stream and sustainability with its current fan base or declining fan base or stagnant fan base. So no, I don't think that the numbers need to keep like multiplying and multiplying. If anything, I think the way that games work is that there's typically a shelf life or like a period at which they plateau, and that varies significantly for games. I think it's more about aligning with key developers, and for a particular game, proving what value you have to the league, and then any kind of future titles that developer may come out with, that you are kind of at the table or you're relevant for picking up the esports component of marketing and team participation and cultivation of athletes in that particular game. And so, yeah, I think the overall growth of esports as a whole and across all games will continue to grow just based on the number of millennials and Gen Ys. I think both of those populations are bigger than the baby boomer generation. So like talking about a lot of people, and specifically just in the US. So yeah, I'm not worried about that at all.
So whenever people talk about, I've noticed all the owners so far who've done interviews or made comments on this, they all really sell the angle of like, if it was just about me, if I just wanted to make the most money or succeed the most, maybe I'd do things differently. But I care about like the health of the league and, building something long lasting. All this, it's really great rhetoric, right? But here's the thing. If I went the other way, if I just joined that way of thinking and I say, right, yeah, let's make the most popular league that everyone loves and has a great engagement. You know what? The actual best way to do that, probably, if we're going to be very cynical, is let's make the WWE. Let's like just, we won't tell people, but we'll decide who plays in which player goes to which team to make great drama. We'll actually decide the playoff matchups, so we always get like CLG, TSM in the play. You could go really, really cynical in this sense. And while obviously no one's really going to do that, at the same time, some of the aspects of this deal mean that, for example, everyone kind of shares what revenues they make off things, merchandising, sponsorships, etc. Yes, people share the money that's made from the broadcasting rights. There's a back and forth flow. It's not just coming only back down from Riot. So in this world where there's a lot of sharing and the bigger the pie gets, as you say, everyone's getting their share of it, etc. It's no longer about who does the best deal to get some money to buy the player necessarily. So what metrics actually will determine who wins? What metrics will determine competition? Can you explain that?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things in there. One, the idea of moving more to like a draft or even a prescribed match system. And I think that for the overall health of the league, if the community wants it and that's what's going to drive viewership, then why the fuck wouldn't you do it? So if the community, if like the League of Legends fans said, we want a draft, and every post on Reddit was like, we want end of season drafts, like give it to us. Okay. I bet you that the league would start doing drafts because that's what the fans want. And that's the whole reason why we're in this, is because we're creating content for fans. So I would say that the league should hopefully, the players and the teams, contribute to Riot's thought on what that broadcast should look like and how the format of the matches should be. So I think, yeah, so I think that's how it was going to work. I forgot the second part of the question.
Okay, the second part was essentially, if we are in a world where essentially everyone shares, like, it doesn't matter. In theory, I mean, I realize there's some key loopholes in how this works in the NBA, etc. In theory, it doesn't matter how much the LA Lakers make. You know, they share some with the Minnesota Timberwolves, you know. So in this world, what factors actually will be the metrics that decide who wins and who loses? Like, where will the competition come from? Because it's not anymore just like, okay, Jack killed this terrible team in terms of sponsors, so he can buy a better player and he can go that approach, you know. What will be the metrics that will determine who wins and who loses?
I think it's going to come down to sports management. It's going to be player selection, not just based on individual skill, but picking a team that's cohesive. You know, how you think about putting a team together. Do you just grab a bunch of star players, or do you grab one leader, one in-game leader, and then surround them with people that are intelligent and supply information? Do you, how do you think about the team environment and the types of personalities from these players? How much confidence do you have in your ability to teach concepts to your players? And so I think like a combination of all these things that already exist in other professional sports on building a team and training a team that's what will dictate success for teams in the league.
So another aspect is, again, okay, it's great that everyone's sharing the revenues, etc. It means that you have, even though you compete, you have a team element, you know, where everyone benefits from everyone's success. But I've noticed that in all the models I'm aware of that use a franchise approach in traditional sports, and they're nearly all North American, quite frankly, they nearly all come with salary caps. I mean, I noticed that Hotshot used the term economic levers, which is a really great way to describe it, you know? Now, what's funny is, actually, a lot of people who are fans might naively think that people who are the really, really rich teams and who make a lot of revenue wouldn't want that. But actually, I've noticed they do. And the reason why they want that in general in these sports is because they don't want what happens in European football to happen. Now, in European soccer, European football, the best model for anyone who doesn't know it and who's American is it's the LPL. Like, if you really are some crazy rich billionaire guy and you're like, you know what, I actually don't care about losing $100 million a year, I just want to win the league, you can just come in and go, you know what, I'll spend more than everyone else, I'll buy all these I'll just go completely nuts, you know. Now, that's usually why people in franchise systems don't want that guy to come in and start doing that, because even though we're all sharing and we're all doing this aspect, he can still just win the game. I mean, he's sort of rigging the game himself, you know, he's using an unfair advantage. So just as a concept, if not now, in the future, do you think that a franchise system should have economic levers like this, that in some way, again, we make what you said before, the metrics for success, how you pick the team? There shouldn't be someone who can just come in and waste money, even if they fit all the criteria. What do you think as a concept?
Yeah. So two-part. First, it's the selection of the partners that will be included in the franchise. And I think there needs to be some consideration to their motivations as team owners to prohibit this kind of arms race that may actually be a detriment to the health of the league. And so, for example, let's say that Riot was going to allow they were going to allow ExxonMobil to be a partner in the league, right? Like, holy fuck, they've got a lot of money, right?
For sure, yes.
They could just do whatever they want, and like corporate ownership altogether, like they don't even care about running an esports team, right? Like, what are their motivations? They have other business interests and all kinds of stuff. But you decide to add a partner like ExxonMobil, and then let's say they decided to add on Shell. Like, what do you think's going to happen, right? So one is the decision on who you put at the table, and then two, I think the other thing is how do you monitor it, and are there like these financial mechanisms that can be used, or levers, or that can disincentivize certain teams from coming in and offering 50 times the market rate for a player, right? And to create that kind of arms race LPL kind of system. I honestly have no idea how you do that. I really don't have much like philosophy on the best way to structure that, but I do think that without salary caps, it can create harm to the league. But it's very tough to say because you want players to make the most possible.
Sure, yes.
And you don't want to like cap the level of their compensation, but it could be damaging to the league if there wasn't, because then it becomes who has the most money, not who's running the best team. And I think therein lies some detriment to like the narrative behind the league, right? You don't want to just be like, oh, well, the guy that's always winning is, the Chinese billionaire because he spent, $10 million per player. It's like, well, how fun is that to watch, So I think the product, the league, kind of suffers when some of those things are out of whack.
Okay. So, as we've kind of outlined here, in terms of the fact that obviously it should be pretty reasonable that all the people selected to be the partners could raise this money, and the way it's outlined, it would even probably be, as you said, very appealing to many people. So presumably, we don't know yet what the economic levers would be, but a lot of people could get the money and could get in the game essentially, and then there'd be it would be a somewhat a fair game. People are sharing the revenues, etc., and all that they get in, and presumably, hopefully, everyone pulls their weight. And then, as we said, the metrics that decide who wins essentially are like, can you pick a good player? Can you put a good team together? Aspects that you would have in a game if you were to play a game like a board game with someone. No one would start with more than anyone else. Now, with that said, I would say, perhaps naively, that one of your strengths as an owner, you specifically, has been business acumen. If we look over the years, there's two things you've done a very good job of. One, I actually would go ahead and wager that you've probably signed more star players than I can think of any GM, any owner figure in league. Actually, now, yeah, people could meme that you didn't get as many results at them, but you signed a lot of big names and a lot of star players at the time. And part of the reason you were able to do that is by having your team at the forefront of having some of the best business deals and some of the best sponsorships, and then moving at the right time into the investment world. So under what you can envision the franchise system might look like, will all that suddenly go away? Do you just suddenly give up your advantages in that area? Now you just have to be the guy who can scout players and have the right management and put the infrastructure. Will you still be able to gain advantages from your business acumen in that sense? Can you still make deals that will somehow benefit you? What do you think of that as a topic?
Yeah. I think one area that will become more relevant from my arsenal of expertise would be scouting new talent, which I think will naturally happen more in a franchise system. So, as you probably know, with Team LoL Pro and Curse Academy and Team Liquid Academy and all of these teams, like I just have my way of thinking about up and coming rookies and how to evaluate their strength and development as players. And so I think I'll have to look to that and really develop more players as a result. And I think as you read, the academy requirement in LCS, I think is a entry point into that. As far as where we gain advantages, if we can't really just go out and like recruit some of these players, I think we'll gain advantages in terms of performance. We're going to have to gain advantages in the methodologies and the practices that we use to coach and develop talent. But the other way that we'll gain advantages is how we create content and how we publish that and create inviting emotional connections with our fans. And it's really the combination of the two. Obviously, winning is so important, and that has priority because everything else kind of falls in line. But you also need to tell the narrative of your players and develop their brands and increase their notoriety. And I think that's something that we just do really well. I'm not sure if you watch like Breaking Point or some of the stuff that we have on our chat. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. So I think we do a really great job of like being real and transparent and creating content. So I think it's like a two things.
So one downside, I'm coming to the end here, by the way. One downside of the fact that, while I praised the fact that you took in all the star players and you did often look for upgrades, and here's a key element. In the past, you often made the harsh ones. Like a famous one, okay, was you had Bonnie Fufu there, and everyone was like, this guy's going to be a superstar. But you brought in Nick Special, who at the time was the better player, and he was the upgrade, he was the veteran, and you needed the leadership presence stuff. So if I say to people, okay, I realize Bonnie Fufu's not as big a name now, but at one point in time, he was tipped to be, one of the next top players. You obviously had Dardoch, again, someone who, admittedly, he's been to a few teams now, but people still look to as the future of NA jungling. You obviously, one thing people forget about is Smoothie. That's a killer right there, because we saw what happened here in Cloud9. Now, in a world where we have the franchising model, let's say these players hadn't left Europe, would these players be bench players? Is that how you see this sort of thing going? How would it work in that particular sense? Like, would you have just an expanded team and you could have many players for every position? What do you think of that as a topic of what can change?
Yeah, I think in a future model, we would, as best as possible, maintain at least one, if not two, substitute positions per role. And they would either fill our academy team, or they would be active subs that would be working out of our facility and living out of our gaming complex. So that gives us a lot of development, healthy pressure between starters and non-starters, and I think would enable us to have the right options to put together the right teams. And if I had to regret one thing the most out of everything that I've done in League of Legends, my biggest regret is walking away from the challenger scene. After putting so much time and effort and energy in developing teams and just managing them, and in the 1 year where Riot came out and said, look, you can't promote back into the LCS, and I naively thought, okay, well, we shouldn't have a challenger team, and I kick myself for that, because we should have maintained a challenger team, even for the level of competition of the main team, and also the flexibility to move in between positions. So the short answer is yes. All of these stars that started at Team LiQuID and developed into amazing players, would hopefully be retained on the roster of Team LiQuID. And one other thing that I'd like to just say here is that a lot of players have come to Team LiQuID and started their careers and their development and went on to other teams. And a lot of people fault me for that, at least to the stuff that I read online. It's like, well, why did you just let Smoothie go? Why did you let Bunny Fufu go? Why'd you? Sure. And, my response to that is that I have always put the player first and put their career first, even before the competitiveness of the Team LiQuID team. And oftentimes, when another team wanted a particular player and we already had a starter, I would sometimes do no buyout, and I would just let the player go and play for that team, because I felt like that was the right thing to do. And I was never holding them back from opportunity in their own personal career growth. And it was probably one of the major deficits to how successful Team LiQuID could be, but it was more like the heart that I had for them as individuals and where they could go and grow their careers. So I don't know. It's just to your point, in the franchise system, we'll be able to retain more of that talent under an official structure with an academy team.
Okay, at the end of the interview, do you have anything you want to end on as a final message, or something you want to thank or say hello to?
Yeah. We of course thank our partners. We have been in business. We were in business for 10 plus years, and we would never been able to survive without them. And the second thing is that to our Team LiQuID fans that are in League of Legends, I know that this has been extremely rough, and you are disappointed and you're angry, because you've come to expect that Team LiQuID is a team that delivers results. From before LCS, even in ESL Pro League, we have been consistently, fourth or third for over 5 years. And I am as upset and as angry at where we're at. And all I can say is that I'm going to do everything that I possibly can in order to fix that. And hopefully that bears fruit. But I appreciate your support and continue, being a fan of the organization.
Hey, this is Travis Gafford, the double lift expert, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.